Welcome to the overview of the stack. The stack is a game system used for resolving abilities and summons in a first-in, last-out method. In the Final Fantasy trading card game, anytime you play an ability or summon, they don't immediately trigger, but are put onto an imaginary pile in the order that they are played. Whenever an ability or summon is activated, a stack is created and must resolve before the game can progress. The first ability, usually activated by the turn player, goes at the bottom of the stack, as well as any other abilities he chooses to activate while holding priority. Once done, he will pass priority to his opponent for any responses they may have before it resolves. Once both players pass priority, beginning at the top of the stack, you resolve down one ability or summon at a time until the stack is completely resolved. Although it is common in practice for players to play abilities or summons without going through all the steps of a stack, the process still occurs. It's usually just skipped out of habit and saving time. Often the stack is only brought up when you need to resolve multiple things in a row or get a little better clarity of what resolved. To help with this, we will use visual aids of the cards that the abilities come from in order to explain how the stack resolves. In this game, priority is used to determine who goes first in most situations. Priority, for most scenarios, begins with a turn player. Whenever the player has priority, this is when he can play abilities or summons. To resolve said actions, you must pass priority to your opponent for any responses they may have before they may resolve. So we begin with turn player having priority. The first thing the turn player does is play Al Cid to the field. Al Cid has an auto ability whenever he enters the field. At this point, if any information is required for the ability when it's put onto the stack, that information is now referenced during placing. For this example, we will assume when Al Cid entered the field, the opponent had an active forward that the turn player was able to select to use his ability. In this instant, he will choose the opponent's forward, Ramza. At this point, the ability has not resolved. Only the target has been chosen and the ability has been put onto the stack. Now, the turn player passes priority to the opponent. Your opponent has a chance to respond to your ability before it resolves. In this instant, your opponent will respond by triggering Ramza's ability, in which he activates a backup. But the main intent here is to dull Ramza, thus making him no longer a valid target for Al Cid's ability still waiting on the stack. Ramza's ability is now added to the stack and the opponent passes priority back to the turn player. With no response from the turn player, both have passed, and the top ability on the stack resolves. Ramza's ability has now resolved, and priority returns to the turn player. The turn player, now with Al Cid having an invalid target, chooses to play a new summon, Fairy. This he gets to choose one forward and activate it. Choosing Ramza, he now places Fairy onto the stack, hoping to reactivate Ramza so Al Cid's ability will not be invalid and fizzle at its resolution. Note that he does not draw a card at this point when it goes onto the stack, but must wait until the ability resolves. Now the turn player has passed priority to his opponent. His opponent now responds with a special ability from his backup, Aerith. This ability makes all forwards from the opponent unable to be chosen by summons or abilities until the end of the turn. This is his hope for canceling Al Cid's target. This ability, again, has not resolved yet and is put onto the stack. The opponent now passes priority back to the turn player for any responses he may have before resolution. Seeing how once Aerith resolves, Ramza will no longer be a valid target for Alcid's ability, so the turn player plays another special ability from his field, this time from his forward 7. 7's special ability Snakebite allows you to choose one special ability or auto ability and cancel its effect. In this situation, 7 will choose Aerith's special ability on the stack and cancel it from resolving, and removing it from the stack. Note that whenever an ability targets a summon or ability, you are targeting the unresolved abilities floating on the stack. Once they are resolved, they are no longer a target for a cancellation effect such as this. You need to cancel them before they resolve. The turn player passes priority again for any responses from the opponent, but he has no responses and passes priority back. And thus the top ability Snakebite resolves, removing Aerith with it. Now that it is resolved, priority returns to turn player for any actions. The turn player has no responses, so passes priority to the opponent. Seeing how the opponent does not want Ramza to be activated, while he has priority, he casts a new summon, Carbuncle. Carbuncle chooses one summon targeting a character he controls and cancels its effect. In this situation, he chooses the fairy on the stack, waiting to trigger, and cancels it. Now that Carbuncle has chosen its summon, it is put on the stack and the opponent passes priority back to the turn player for responses. The turn player has no responses to Carbuncle, so it resolves, cancelling the fairy and removing it from the stack. Note that this has stopped the player from activating Fairy's second effect and the turn player does not get to draw a card. Now that they have resolved, priority returns to the turn player again for anything he'd like to add to the stack. At the present moment, Alcid's target Ramza is still dull and Alcid's ability will fizzle when it resolves due to an invalid active target. The turn player decides to respond with another ability from his backup, Astrologian, which allows him to choose a target and activate it. The player chooses Ramza as the target and puts the ability onto the stack, and then passes priority to his opponent for responses. The opponent has unfortunately spent all his resources and does not have any responses, so passes priority back to turn player, and the top ability, Astrologian, on the stack resolves, reactivating Ramza. Priority returns to the turn player for anything he'd like to add, but he has no responses, so passes priority to his opponent. The opponent again has no responses, so passes priority back, and the last ability on the stack resolves. Alcid's ability, upon resolve, now has a valid active target, Ramza, so now the turn player may play a lightning forward of cost 3 or less from his hand onto the field, and if he does so, he deals Ramza 6,000 damage. Ramza is now at 6,000 damage of his 7,000 power and is still alive. At this point, Alcid's ability continues to resolve and he plays Onion Knight to the field. Now that the stack is empty, any additional triggers or effects are added to the stack to resolve before the stack is finished. The Onion Knight that was played from Alcid's effect had its own when entering the field ability, so it goes onto the stack. Turn player chooses Ramza as the target and waits for it to resolve. He passes priority to his opponent, who also passes it back, and the ability resolves, dealing the damage to Ramza and finally breaking it. With the stack empty, priority returns to the turn player to continue with the game. Some extra notes about the stack. Whenever a player receives damage and triggers an X burst, they do not use the stack and it resolves completely before any auto abilities or responses may trigger. This means no priority is passed to the opponent, so they cannot respond to the X-Burst. After an X-Burst resolves, if any effects are triggered by its resolution, then they may start a new stack and resolve until the stack is empty. The next note: whenever an ability is activated from a character on the field, it is now separate from the character it came from. Breaking or removing the said character from the field will not counter the ability that is now waiting on the stack. You must respond to the abilities themselves for a chance to counter them. One note is that there is a difference between choose and select when resolving abilities. For abilities and summons that say choose, this is made during activating the abilities and adding them to the stack, such as the situation for Alcid or Fairy. Select, however, is made at resolution, meaning you don't need to make a choice when adding it to the stack, only when it's resolving. Examples of this are Famfrit or Cloud of Darkness. In the example of these two, when both players must make a selection, selection begins with the turn player and then the opponent selects their targets. Also, be careful of the wording of how some abilities resolve. For example, Zidane from Opus 3 has an ability that when he enters the field, your opponent reveals his or her hand and you select one card from their hand. Your opponent discards this card. So the ability goes onto the stack, and your opponent has yet to reveal his hand. Passing priority, your opponent has a chance to use abilities from his hand before the ability resolves. If your opponent has no response and passes priority back, then Zidane's ability resolves. This is when your opponent reveals their hand and you select one card for them to discard. The ability then finishes and resolves in full, so your opponent at this point does not have any opportunity to respond to the card you select in between then and discarding it. One note about priority: whenever a player has priority, a common misunderstanding is that when you add an ability or summon to the stack, the priority is automatically switched to your opponent to respond to. Although turn player is the default priority for multiple stages of the stack, priority is not automatically switched. It is given to your opponent to progress the game. This means that whenever I have priority, I would be able to add multiple abilities to the stack in succession, so long as I pay for them, before passing priority to my opponent. Note that no abilities on the stack have an opportunity to resolve unless you pass priority and give your opponent a chance to respond. Two often used examples would be, while the turn player has priority, to use forwards like Light Cloud or Bravest Sword Gilgamesh, who have Brave, to declare an attack, and then while the turn player still retains priority, to use their special ability Omnislash or Bravest Sword, and adding it to the top of the stack. Since these two forwards have Brave, they don't need to dull to attack, so you can attack, then stack their removal ability before your opponent has a chance to declare blockers. This can be devastating for your opponent if done right. Your opponent still has an opportunity to respond, however he cannot declare blockers until the stack is empty again. This concludes my overview of the stack for the Final Fantasy trading card game. I hope that this video clarified a few confusing things about the stack and helped players better understand it. Thanks for watching.